The precarious nature of the rock band replacement frontman is well known, but sometimes it's not just the criticism of fans, the desire of bands to reunite classic lineups, or simply a lack of compatibility with a long-established unit that scuppers the chance of a new lead singer. Sometimes the new boy can bugger it up all by himself, and few singers have managed to do that with such spectacular immediacy as Graham Bonnet, when he brought his brief involvement with the Michael Schenker Group to an end on his very first gig. This is the Overlooked Hotel, and this is the story of Flashdance, Graham Bonnet's infamous fall from grace. So let's have some background first for those of you who may be unfamiliar with the British heavy metal scene of 1982. The Michael Schenker Group was the vanity project of the former Scorpions and UFO guitarist, Michael Schenker, who was inexplicably popular in the early 1980s. Starting out as a solo project, MSG, as the band would become known, presumably because no one was aware of the existence of monosodium glutamate, evolved into a real group. Admittedly one consisting of hired, paid session players rather than anything organically formed, with their second album. A hugely popular live album recorded at the Budokan in Japan telegraphed the band to the upper echelons of the metal scene at a time when the new wave of British heavy metal had brought new popularity to the genre, and a decision was made to capitalise on this success by pushing the band to the next level, which meant a need to replace vocalist Gary Barden with somebody better, which seemed to translate into somebody more famous. Band manager Peter Mensch wanted David Coverdale, whose Whitesnake project, while popular in the UK, had failed to crack America, and who might well have been looking for an excuse to shut it all down and move on. But Schenker was perhaps wary of hiring the former Deep Purple frontman, who was arguably much more famous and successful than he was. His choice was Graham Bonnet. Bonnet was, at that time, and still is now, best known as the man who'd replaced Ronnie James Dio in Rainbow, helping take the band away from the sword and sorcery style of the Dio years into a more commercial pop metal sound in 1979. He was an unlikely metal frontman for the time, short-haired, given to wearing suits, and by his own admission more of an R&B singer than a rock god, who'd recorded Bee Gees songs and been married to actress and pop star Adrienne Poster. But he had a powerful voice that was suited to classic rock operatics, and while the purists were appalled, the newly mainstreamed Rainbow had two big hit singles, Since You've Been Gone and All Night Long, and set the scene for the rest of the band's 1980s output. But his time with the band was short, possibly because his hair was short, lasting just one album before he moved on to a solo career. He had a hit single as a solo artist, Night Games, but by 1982 was open to offers. Schenker's insistence on hiring Bonnet saw Mensch sever his connection with the band, which actually made the need to get a new frontman redundant, and before long, Cozy Powell, who'd worked with Bonnet in Rainbow, and keyboardist Paul Raymond, not the magazine publisher, had also quit. We shouldn't read too much into this. The band members were, after all, employees rather than equal partners, and Powell in particular rarely stayed with any project for too long. But this meant that MSG was now made up entirely of unfamiliar faces other than Schenker himself, and fans were particularly horrified at how Barden, who they were very fond of, had been brutally ousted, especially as he'd been co-writer on the songs featured in the previous two albums and therefore seemed like an integral part of the band. Metal fans of the time still looked at Bonnet with some suspicion. Image mattered a lot more back in 1982, and many still thought of his time in Rainbow as a sellout by the band. While Rainbow Furor Richie Blackmore may have actually been the person responsible for the musical shift, Bonnet, with his pop star image and admitted disinterest in heavy rock, seemed much easier to blame. Rainbow was at least a traditional rock band rather than a new wave of British heavy metal act, which Schenker's band seemed more of a part of, even if the bandleader was a German who'd been around since the mid-70s. Bonnet didn't seem part of that scene at all, and the letters pages of Kerrang and Sounds were full of outrage whining. Ignoring the criticism, Schenker and his new band pressed ahead with the third MSG studio album, the awkwardly titled Assault Attack. Despite solid production by Martin Birch, the album was generally a lackluster effort, complete with a dismal cover, and fans inevitably blamed Bonnet, who had replaced Baden as co-writer as well as singer. In truth, MSG was never more than a second division band who had somehow or other become flavour of the month in metal circles, with mostly forgettable songs and a live show that had to stop every few minutes to allow another Schenker guitar solo. I had a schoolmate who was a big fan and so was dragged along to one of their 1983 shows, and they were terrible. It's entirely likely that the third album was always going to be the start of a decline that saw the band fizzle out. And so we now come to August 1982, when the new version of MSG had just issued the single Dancer, a song that fans seemed decidedly split by, but which reached number 52 in the UK charts, and so was the band's biggest hit. The group had a prestigious slot at the Reading Festival lined up to both introduce the new singer and plug the new album. To warm up for the show, they decided to play a gig at Sheffield Polytechnic the day before as part of a council-promoted event with cheap tickets. A solid idea, but at which point everything went terribly, terribly wrong. Bonnet, perhaps feeling nervous, had spent the whole day drinking with rockstar chums after having an argument with his new employer, and by the time the gig was due to start, he was in no fit state to impress an audience of cynical fans who didn't even want him to be there in the first place. Having had no time to learn the old songs, he taped the lyrics to the monitors, but as the crowd surged forward, the lyric sheets were torn off. The audience started to shout "fuck off" at Bonnet, and, perhaps unwisely, he rose to the occasion and swore back. Then, and things become a little vague at this point, he seemingly fell into the crowd, and on the way back to the stage managed to burst his trousers open. Like all good rock stars, Bonnet wore no underwear, and little Graham popped out, a moment of accidental exposure that Bonnet then foolishly decided to make a part of the show, waving his penis at the audience while still shouting drunken abuse at them. Now, there's probably a time and a place for drunken rock stars to wave their dicks at audiences, but a gig by a very serious and self-important German guitarist on the verge of a big festival show is probably not it. As his performance entirely abandoned attempts at singing and instead degenerated into drunken abuse and willy waving, Bonnet was helped off stage by band members who then struggled through a few instrumental numbers before winding the show up early. Any disappointment from fans at the curtailed performance was probably mitigated by the knowledge that they had just seen a thoroughly unique experience, one that, in those days before camera phones and social media, was sadly never recorded for posterity. As you might expect, Bonnet was fired the next morning. To the delight of fans, Baden was reinstated.
Surprise, surprise! This was gone! I'm ready!
It was, sadly, a short-lived triumph for the singer. There would be just one more MSG album before both fans and the music press lost interest, before Schenker packed it in and he was once again pushed from the limelight. Bonnet would go on to form Alcatraz and then had a variety of short-lived projects. You probably wouldn't have expected him to work with Schenker again. But time and money are great healers. In 2016, Bonnet joined the other former MSG singers, of which by this point there were several, in the Michael Schenker Fest, a vanity event with the guitarist reliving the glory days of his band, performing a few songs on a Japanese tour that was later expanded to other countries, and a live album a year later. This time, Bonnet managed to keep his trousers on. With the passage of time and tastes changing, Bonnet is now finally accepted as part of the rock alumni and recognised for the important work that he did in the early 1980s. He's still going strong today. If you enjoy this sort of scandalous tale, then be sure to like, subscribe, share, and check out our other videos. A fine collection of weird stories and forgotten histories. And let us know in the comments, do you remember Graham Bonnet's mishap? Were you at the gig? And what's the worst thing you've ever seen somebody do on stage? As ever, thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.